The rain came down in cold, relentless sheets that morning, streaking the wide glass windows of Cornerstone Café and turning the street outside into a gray mirror of the sky above. Inside, the air smelled of espresso and warm bread, and the hum of conversation rose and fell like something living, comfortable and familiar to everyone who came here often enough to know where the best table was, which barista remembered your order, and which corner of the room stayed quietest when the lunch crowd filtered in. It was the kind of place that asked nothing of you, except that you stay a little while, and most people were glad to oblige. The rain made it easier. The rain made it feel necessary. Marcus Johnson arrived at 7:45, same as every weekday, stepping through the door and closing his umbrella, in one quiet motion before shaking the water from the shoulders of his jacket. An old canvas field coat, faded olive green, softened by years into something that fit him like a second skin. He was a tall man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with close-cropped gray at his temples that had arrived a decade before its time, and a face that carried the particular stillness of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by the world. He moved through the cafe with an unhurried ease that was not laziness, but something closer to economy, every step placed with a calm precision that went unnoticed precisely because it looked so natural, so thoroughly unremarkable. He nodded to the couple near the door. He held the inner door open for an elderly woman maneuvering a canvas tote bag. He settled into his usual corner table, the one with the wall at his back, and a clear sight line to both the entrance and the service counter, and set his bag down, drew out a paperback novel with a cracked spine, and opened it to a page he had marked with a folded receipt. Linda Reyes was already moving toward him from behind the counter, a ceramic mug in each hand. She was the morning shift supervisor, a woman in her mid-40s, with dark hair pinned back, and a manner so brisk and warm at the same time that new customers often mistook it for impatience. Before they understood, it was simply efficiency in the shape of affection. She set the black coffee in front of Marcus without a word, and the second mug, a green tea she kept on hand for a regular, who had not yet arrived on the adjacent table. "Cold one," she said, and Marcus glanced up from his book just long enough to agree. "Getting colder," he said. And that was all that needed to be said. And Linda moved back toward the counter with the quiet satisfaction of someone performing a ritual that works. He read for 20 minutes before he looked up, not because anything had disturbed him, but because his eyes, trained by years of professional habit to sweep and assess without being seen to do so, had registered the arrival of someone new, or rather, someone unfamiliar enough to notice. She came in through the street door with her coat pulled close, shaking rain from her dark hair and scanning the room with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone deciding whether this was, in fact, the right place. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, with sharp, thoughtful eyes, and the look of someone who spent most of her day making decisions and was accustomed to making good ones. She found a table near the window, ordered something from the passing server, and pulled out a laptop. Marcus looked back at his book. Her name was Sophia Reeves, and she had moved to this part of the city 3 weeks ago, following a divorce that had been, in her own careful assessment, entirely the correct decision and entirely devastating anyway. She had chosen Cornerstone Café because it was 2 blocks from the apartment she was renting and because it had the kind of lighting that did not make her feel watched. She noticed Marcus almost immediately, not because he was particularly conspicuous, but because of the opposite. In a room full of people, performing the small theater of their morning routines, checking their phones, chatting too loudly, shuffling through their bags, he was simply still, reading his book, drinking his coffee, present in a way that seemed unusual. She did not speak to him that first morning. She did not speak to him the second morning either. But by the third, she had begun to look for him when she came in, and that, she recognized, was the beginning of something she had not yet named. She noticed, over those first several days, that Marcus treated the cafe staff with a consistent, unperformed courtesy that stood apart from the reflexive politeness of most customers. He said thank you, and meant it. He remembered names. When old Mr. Hadley knocked his cane against the door frame on his way out one morning, and Marcus was closer to the door than anyone else. He was on his feet, and moving before the sound had finished echoing, steadying the old man's elbow with a gentle firmness that suggested he had steadied people before in circumstances that mattered considerably more. And there were the scars. She had noticed them one morning when he rolled up his sleeve to check a message on his phone. Two pale lines on the inside of his left forearm, another at the edge of his wrist, the kind of marks that did not come from accidents in kitchens or workshops. She had not stared, but she had noticed, and the noticing had lodged somewhere in her thinking like a question she had not yet decided to ask. He carried something, she thought. Not grief, exactly, or not only grief. Something older and quieter. The kind of weight that comes not from a single loss, but from having seen enough of the world to understand exactly how much of it does not go the way it should, and having made a kind of peace with that knowledge without pretending it was anything other than what it was. She did not know why she felt this so clearly from a man she had barely spoken to. She only knew that she did, and that it made her curious in a way she had not expected to be curious about anything for a very long time. Ethan Carr arrived on a Tuesday, which was, in retrospect, the wrong day for everyone, but most especially for Ethan Carr himself. He came in with three men who moved with the particular confidence of people who had never been made to feel small in any room they had entered, and he was the loudest among them, which was saying something. He was perhaps 38, with the kind of good looks that are almost entirely undermined by the expression that comes with them, a permanent edge of condescension, a narrowing of the eyes that was not intelligence, but the performance of it. His coat was cashmere. His watch was the kind that people who cared about watches cared about. He wore both as though he expected them to do work on his behalf, announcing him before he had to announce himself. He scanned the café upon entering with the assessing gaze of a man who divides rooms into people who matter and people who do not. And the scan was fast, because the category he placed most people in required very little deliberation. His group claimed a table near the center of the room, not the largest table, but the one with the most visibility, which was the point. They ordered loudly. They laughed at things that were not quite funny enough to merit the volume the laughter received. The other customers adjusted almost imperceptibly, the way people do when a room's atmosphere shifts, leaning slightly away, lowering their voices, going a little more private. It was Ethan who noticed Marcus first, or rather, it was Ethan who noticed Marcus's coat, because that was the level at which Ethan's attention operated. He said something to the man beside him, something low, and the man smirked. And then Ethan said it louder, because the audience was not large enough at its original volume. "Look at that. You think he knows what century we're in?" One of his companions laughed. Another glanced over with mild discomfort and then looked away. Marcus did not look up from his book. He turned a page. He lifted his coffee mug and drank. The word Ethan used next was not quite the worst word he could have chosen, but it was in the same neighborhood, and it landed in the room with enough weight that two tables nearby went completely quiet. Sophia looked up from her laptop screen and felt something cold move through her that was not entirely surprise and not entirely anger, but something close to both. She looked at Marcus. His face had not changed. He had set the coffee mug back down with the same unhurried care with which he did everything, and he was looking at his book, and there was no tension visible anywhere in his body, in his jaw, in his shoulders, in his hands. And that stillness was so complete and so deliberate that it required more from him than any visible reaction would have. She was certain of this. She did not know how she was certain, but she was. Linda, behind the counter, had gone very still in a different way, the stillness of controlled professional restraint. She caught the eye of the server nearest to Ethan's table and gave a small, precise shake of her head that meant, "Not yet. Keep watching. I'll handle it." She had handled things before. She would handle this. But she was also watching Marcus, the same way Sophia was watching Marcus, with the same quality of attention that recognized something in his stillness that went beyond mere patience. Ethan, reading silence as permission, continued. He leaned back in his chair with the expansive ease of a man who had never once in his adult life faced a consequence that arrived before he was ready for it, and he began to comment to his companions, loudly enough to carry on the visible poverty of Marcus's possessions, his laptop bag, his book, his jacket, his probable station in life. He touched the corner of Marcus's table as he gestured, a deliberate intrusion into space, and Marcus finally looked up. Their eyes met. And here was the moment that Ethan, in his considerable experience of social confrontations, misread so completely that it would take him the rest of this story to fully understand what he had seen. He had looked for anger. He had looked for embarrassment. He had looked for the flinch that told him he had landed. He found none of these things. He found instead a pair of dark, calm eyes that looked at him with a focused absence of feeling that was not passivity, but something considerably more deliberate. And it was a look that made something in Ethan's lizard brain twitch with an instinct he immediately overrode with his ego. He smiled. He turned back to his companions. He said something that made them laugh. Marcus looked back at his book. Sophia found herself unable to look away from him. She wanted to say something to Ethan. She wanted to stand up and articulate precisely and publicly what she thought of him. But she was also watching something happen in front of her that she could not name. Something in the quality of Marcus's stillness that told her, without any rational justification, that intervention was not only unnecessary, but might somehow diminish whatever it was she was witnessing. So she sat, and she watched, and she thought about the scars on Marcus's wrist. Why do you let him talk to you like that? She asked him the question 20 minutes later, after Ethan and his group had moved on to loudly cataloging the deficiencies of the cafe's menu, and the room had settled into a cautious normalcy. She had moved without quite deciding to move, taking her coffee to the empty chair across from Marcus's table, and settling into it with the manner of someone who has made a practical decision. He looked up from his book. He considered her for a moment in that measuring way he had, which she was already beginning to recognize as his equivalent of an extended pause. Because not every battle is worth fighting, he said. She thought about that. He was being cruel, she said. Yes, Marcus agreed. He was. And that doesn't make you angry? He looked at her with something that was almost warmth, or the careful edge of it. I've been angry, he said. I've been angry in situations that would make what just happened seem like a polite disagreement. What you're seeing right now isn't the absence of anger. It's what comes after. She did not know what to say to that. She said nothing. She drank her coffee. He went back to his book. And that was their first real conversation, and it was enough to make her come back the next morning, already thinking about what she might say to continue it. The day Sophia spoke to Linda about Marcus was a Friday, and she did not frame it as asking about Marcus. She framed it as asking Linda how long she had worked at the cafe, which was true as a question, and also a doorway. And Linda, who had been managing people and situations for long enough to know a doorway when she saw one, stepped through it helpfully. She had worked here 6 years. She had known Marcus for 4. He came in every weekday, sometimes weekends. He tipped well and without show. He had once spent 45 minutes sitting with a young woman who had come in clearly distressed after what sounded like a very bad phone call, just listening, not offering advice, just present, and had quietly paid for her coffee and left before she finished. He never talked about himself. She had asked him once what he did for work, and he had said he consulted. And when she had asked what kind, he had smiled and said the kind that doesn't make for good dinner conversation. And she had left it there because the smile had been genuine and the deflection had been kind rather than evasive, or at least it had not felt evasive in a way that worried her. Sophia came back to her table and looked at Marcus, who was doing something on his laptop, actual work. She could tell, not browsing, something that required focus. And she thought about what Linda had said, and thought about the woman in distress, and thought about the scars, and thought about his eyes when Ethan had looked at him. And she thought, this is not an ordinary man. She thought this not with the breathlessness of a fantasy, but with the particular clarity of someone who has learned, through a long and occasionally painful education, to recognize the real thing when it sits across a cafe from her. She caught herself looking at his hands, which were resting on the keyboard now, large and steady and unremarkable from a distance, and she thought about hands that had turned pages and lifted coffee cups and steadied old men in doorways, and she looked away, back to her own screen, and told herself she was being ridiculous, and did not entirely believe it. Their conversations developed over the following days, with the particular texture of things that grow naturally, rather than by intention not scheduled, not constructed, but arising from proximity and the small openings that proximity creates. She told him about the divorce one morning, not in a way that asked for sympathy, but in the way that people sometimes say difficult, true things to relative strangers. Precisely because the stranger is not embedded in the context of the thing, is not involved in its history, and can hear it cleanly. He listened without the well-meaning interjections that her friends offered, the sympathetic noises that were meant to comfort and sometimes landed as a kind of soft interruption. He simply heard her out, and then said, "The hardest part isn't the ending. It's learning to let the story you thought you were living be a different story than you thought it was." She looked at him. "Did someone tell you that?" she asked. "Or did you figure it out?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some things you figure out at a cost," he said. "That one I figured out slowly, which is probably the right way to figure it out." She thought about her marriage, and about the slow, accumulating recognition that it had become something neither of them had intended, and she nodded. And she thought that what he had said was more true and more useful than most of what anyone had said to her in the past several months. He said, on a different morning, "The strongest people I've known weren't the ones who never got knocked down. They were the ones who got up without making a production of it." She wrote that down later, in the notebook she kept for things she wanted to hold on to, and she was slightly embarrassed by this, and also did not particularly care. The Tuesday of the worst week in Ethan Carr's recent life began, the way all his worst days began, with absolute confidence. He arrived at Cornerstone Café in the early afternoon, this time with only one companion, a colleague named Derek, who laughed at the right moments and never contradicted anything, which Ethan found essential in a companion. The rain had started again, heavier than it had been in days, and the café was full, the windows steamed, the noise level higher than usual, with the compressed energy of people who had run inside from the weather. Ethan was in a foul mood that he had decided to disguise as magnanimous superiority, which was his standard strategy for foul moods, and it generally worked to his satisfaction. He saw Marcus in the corner. The sight of him, the same jacket, the same stillness, the same absolute indifference to Ethan's existence, activated something in Ethan that was neither rational nor particularly adult. He crossed the room with his coffee, said something to Derek, and in a motion that could only be described as deliberate, regardless of what excuse he might later manufacture for it, he bumped the table as he passed, hard enough to slosh Marcus's coffee across the open page of his book and down the front of his jacket. He turned around with an expression of theatrical surprise, his hands raised. "Oh, sorry about that," he said, in a tone that was apology-shaped and contained no actual apology. "Hope that wasn't anything important." The café, or at least the 20-person radius around this event, went quiet. Sophia, who had been working near the window and had seen the deliberateness of the motion, felt the particular cold fury that comes from witnessing cruelty done with a smile. She started to stand. Marcus looked at the coffee spreading across his page. He looked at his jacket. He reached into his bag, removed a small cloth, and began, with complete unhurried focus, to blot the liquid from the paper. He did not look at Ethan. He did not acknowledge the waiting, watchful, slightly thrilled tension of the room. He simply dealt with what was in front of him, the way you deal with something that requires attention, calmly and practically, and without performance. Ethan, who had expected something anger, embarrassment, trembling restraint, anything at all, found the absence of reaction to be nearly physically intolerable. He said, "What? Nothing to say?" "Figures." He looked around at the room, including them in whatever point he thought he was making. "Some people just don't have any." And here the door opened. It opened the way cafe doors open in normal circumstances, with a small rush of cold air and the sound of rain, except that what came through it was not normal. 3 men, young, moving fast, faces covered, the first one already talking before the door had closed behind him, the kind of loud and forceful talking that is designed to produce immediate compliance through shock, and the object he was holding made the nature of the situation completely clear within 1 second of their entrance. The second man carried the same kind of object. The third moved immediately to the door and locked it, and the room went from quiet to a different and far more serious kind of quiet, the silence of people understanding simultaneously, that something has just gone badly, irreversibly wrong. Phones on the table, wallets on the table. Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt. We're out in 2 minutes. The first man was moving along the tables, and people were complying, hands shaking, faces pale, the particular frozen compliance of people whose bodies have understood the threat before their minds have fully processed it. One woman near the counter began to cry, a soft, barely audible sound that somehow carried through the whole room. Sophia was 3 tables from the nearest man, close enough that she could see his eyes above the fabric covering his face, and what she saw there was something worse than anger. She saw adrenaline and nervousness combined, which is to say, she saw a person who was not fully in control of what he might do next. Ethan Carr was frozen in a way that had nothing to do with any of the confidence he had been radiating 30 seconds ago. He had gone very pale and very still, and his hands were flat on the table in front of him, and the expression on his face was one that no amount of expensive clothing could dignify. It was raw, unmediated fear, which is the great equalizer, the thing that strips away all the performances we construct to navigate our daily lives and reveals what is underneath. What was underneath Ethan Carr was a frightened man, and in this he was no different from anyone else in the room. And for the first time in this story that was true. Marcus had not moved from his chair, but something had changed. Sophia, from her table, could see it and could not have described it precisely. It was not a change in his posture, which remained relaxed, or in his expression, which remained neutral. It was something in the quality of his attention, which had shifted from the comfortable peripheral awareness of a man reading in a cafe to something else entirely, something precise and total, a kind of focus that did not look like focus from the outside, but felt like it. The way some silences feel louder than noise. His eyes moved in a pattern that was systematic without being visible, as systematic entrance, positions, hands, sight lines, the gap between the second man's attention and the third man's position, the angle and timing involved in each. He was not assessing the situation the way a frightened person assesses a situation, calculating odds of survival. He was reading it the way a professional reads a professional problem, which is to say he already knew several things about what was going to happen next, and he was deciding which version of what was going to happen next was the right one. The first man had reached the counter. Linda was handing over the cash drawer with shaking hands. The second man was moving toward the back of the room, toward the tables where the wallets and phones were accumulating. The third man, at the door, was watching the room, but his attention was not quite equally distributed. It weighted toward the front, toward the group near the counter, which meant his peripheral attention to the left rear of the room was slightly diminished. Marcus registered this. He registered the precise angle and the precise second, and he stood up. What happened next lasted 4 seconds. Not approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds with a precision that Sophia would later try to reconstruct and find she could not, because her perception of it had been overridden by the sheer speed of it, by the quality of compressed inevitability that made it feel, in retrospect, like watching something that had already been decided. The first man went down before he finished turning. Marcus had crossed the space between them, in a movement that Sophia's eyes had registered, but her brain had not fully processed, as movement. She had been watching him at his table, and then he was not at his table, and the first man was on the floor, and Marcus had the weapon, and was already moving. The second man had time to turn, and that was the entirety of what he had time to do. The third man at the door, who had been watching the front of the room, turned toward the sound, and found Marcus already arriving. And the encounter that followed lasted slightly less than 2 seconds, and then he too was on the floor, and Marcus was standing in the center of the room with the controlled, elevated breathing of someone who has just performed a physical task, and his hands were steady, and his face was the same calm face it had always been, just slightly more present, slightly more vivid, like a frequency that has been turned up. The room did not react immediately. The room required several seconds to understand what it had witnessed, to match what its eyes reported with any available category of experience. And for most of the people in Cornerstone Café on that afternoon, no available category came close. Sophia felt the breath come back into her lungs in a long, involuntary rush. The woman who had been crying had stopped crying, which was its own kind of silence. Linda, behind the counter, was staring at Marcus with an expression that Sophia would later describe as recognition. Not surprise, but recognition, as though some long-held theory had just been confirmed. Ethan Carr was looking at Marcus from his table, with the particular, uncomfortable clarity of a man who has just been shown something he cannot unsee. And the thing he had been shown was not only what Marcus was capable of, but also, by direct implication, what he himself was not. Marcus set the weapons on the counter. He said to Linda, "Call 911. Tell them 3 individuals, all conscious, non-critical." He sat back down. He picked up his cloth and finished blotting his book. The police arrived in less than 4 minutes, which was fast, and the officer who came through the door first was not the youngest officer, and not the one with the most urgency in his movement, but the one who, upon scanning the room and its 3 restrained occupants, looked at Marcus with an expression that resolved into something that was not quite professional detachment. Captain Raymond Walsh had been on the force for 27 years and had learned, in that time, to read a room's aftermath, the way a doctor reads an X-ray, looking for the story the surface conceals. He looked at the 3 men on the floor. He looked at the way they were restrained, which was efficient and precise in a way that told him quite a lot about who had done it. And then he looked at Marcus Johnson in the corner, and something in his face changed. He crossed the room slowly, with the practiced deliberateness of a man who has learned that arriving too quickly at certain moments removes the dignity from them. He stopped in front of Marcus's table, and he said, in a voice that was quiet enough that most of the room did not hear it, but that Sophia, 2 tables away, caught with perfect clarity, "Colonel Johnson. Not Mr., not Sir. Colonel." Marcus looked up from his book. He looked at Walsh for a moment, with the patient recognition of someone who has been found before, and has learned that being found is simply something that sometimes happens, and that the correct response is to acknowledge it plainly and move on. He said, "Raymond, it's just Marcus now." Walsh nodded, slowly, with the weight of a man who understands that some transitions deserve to be honored, even when the person making them has long since moved past, requiring the honor. "Of course," he said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Marcus said. The young woman by the window took a hard landing from adrenaline. "But she's okay. The barista behind the counter may want someone to talk to." Walsh nodded again. He looked at Marcus for another moment, with an expression that was not quite awe and not quite gratitude, but lived in the space between them, that compound feeling of recognition and relief that passes between people who have shared a professional world defined by extreme stakes. Then he turned to deal with the scene. The room, which had been processing the violence of the robbery and its resolution, now began to process this new information with the slower, more complicated machinery of social recalibration. Walsh spoke briefly to 2 of his officers, and one of them, a young woman who had been in the force 3 years and kept her expression carefully professional, looked at Marcus with eyes that could not quite achieve what her expression was attempting. Someone, one of the customers who had been near the counter, asked Walsh quietly who Marcus was, and Walsh considered the question for a moment, and then said, in a voice that was not quite quiet enough, "Retired. 22 years special operations. Multiple theaters. He won't want me to say more than that." But the room heard it. Rooms always hear what they are meant to hear. The phrase Delta Force was said by someone, quietly, and then said again at regular volume, and then it circulated in the room with the particular velocity of information that confirms something people had half suspected without being able to name it. Sophia heard it and felt it land with a particular weight. Not surprised she had known, in the wordless way that she had known several things about Marcus from the beginning, but confirmation, which is a different kind of weight. She looked at Marcus, who was speaking to Walsh in a low, efficient voice, answering questions with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to making reports, and she thought about every morning in this cafe and every cup of coffee and every turned page and every moment of absolute stillness, and she understood that what she had been witnessing for weeks was not a man hiding something. It was a man who had decided that what he had been was no longer what he was, and was living that decision with complete commitment every single morning in the same corner table with the same black coffee and the same paperback novel, and that this decision was itself a form of courage, quieter than what she had just witnessed, but no less disciplined, and in its own way, no less remarkable. Ethan Carr left the cafe 20 minutes after the police arrived, after giving his statement, which was factual, and which he had delivered in a voice that was recognizably his own, but stripped of its usual register of casual authority. He did not look at Marcus on his way out. Or rather, he tried not to, and failed, and what the look contained, the brief, involuntary contact of their eyes, was too complicated to easily name. He got into his car, which was parked half a block down, and sat in it for a while with the engine running and the rain on the roof and the particular, uncomfortable stillness of a man who has just been forced to see himself from an angle he does not prefer. The leather seat and the dash and the small, climate-controlled perfection of the cabin had never felt more beside the point. He was accustomed to using his surroundings to confirm something about himself. The watch, the coat, the car, the table in the center of the room, and right now, none of them were doing that work, because the work had been undone, and he was sitting in the silence of its undoing. He thought about the things he had said in this cafe over the past several weeks. The words, the gestures, the deliberate spill, the casual cruelty done in the costume of boredom. He thought about them with the particular sharpness that comes not from guilt alone, but from the specific humiliation of having performed your worst self in front of someone who could have chosen any response and chose only stillness. He thought about what it meant that Marcus had chosen not to react to him, and he thought, for the first time, that the choice might not have been weakness. He sat in his car for 20 minutes. Then he drove home. He called Marcus through the cafe. Linda, who had his number from a form he'd once filled out, passed along the message without commentary 3 days after the robbery. Marcus agreed to meet him at Cornerstone the following morning, which was a Thursday, which was regular, which was Marcus's way. Ethan arrived before Marcus, which was unusual for him, and sat in the corner table, not Marcus's table, but the one nearest to it, and ordered a coffee and waited. Marcus arrived at 7:45. He saw Ethan. He came over without hesitation and sat down and ordered his coffee and looked at Ethan across the table with the same eyes that had looked at him through every piece of ugliness Ethan had offered him. And that look was still, as it had always been, completely without judgment in the conventional sense. It was not the look of someone prepared to deliver a verdict. It was the look of someone willing to hear what you had come to say. Ethan said he was sorry. He said it without qualifications, which was unusual for Ethan, who had spent most of his adult life constructing qualifications the way other people construct furniture carefully, with particular attention to load-bearing joints. He said he had behaved badly. He said he had been operating on assumptions that he was only now beginning to understand were not only wrong, but were the kind of wrong that does not announce itself because it is embedded in the way you have always seen things. He said he didn't fully know why he had done what he'd done, and he thought that was part of what he needed to examine. He said he was sorry. He said it twice. Marcus listened to all of this. He held his coffee mug in both hands and he listened. And when Ethan finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment, in the way he was always quiet, which was not uncomfortable but was deliberate. And then he said, "The wrong you did isn't the important thing right now. The question is what you do next." Ethan looked at him. "That's all?" Marcus considered. "What did you expect?" "More," Ethan said. "Or different. An explanation, maybe. Or anger." "The anger already happened," Marcus said. "I just didn't give it to you. That doesn't mean it wasn't there. It means I decided it wasn't yours to have." Ethan thought about this. He said, "How do you do that?" And Marcus said after a moment, "You practice. Usually in harder situations than the one we were in," which told Ethan, and told it plainly, that what Ethan had put Marcus through was not, in the scale of things Marcus had been put through, a significant ordeal. And this, somehow, made Ethan feel both better and considerably worse at the same time, which was probably the correct combination of feelings for the occasion. They sat for another 30 minutes. The conversation drifted toward other things, Ethan's work, which he described with less pride than usual, as though he were seeing it from a slight distance. Marcus's daughter, whose existence Ethan had not known about and who was, Marcus said, 8 years old and obsessed with marine biology, and had recently informed him, with tremendous authority, that the mantis shrimp had 16 types of color receptors compared to the human 3, which Marcus had found both remarkable and entirely believable, given everything he knew about mantis shrimp and about his daughter. It was the most personal thing Marcus had volunteered in a conversation with Ethan, and Ethan registered it as the thing it was, a small opening, carefully offered, not a gesture of friendship exactly, but a gesture toward the possibility of treating each other as humans rather than as characters in each other's internal narratives. When they left, they did not make plans to meet again, and neither of them suggested it. But Ethan, on the sidewalk, stopped and said, "The day you didn't do anything when I was being what I was being, that taught me more than anything else that happened that week." Marcus looked at him. "Good," he said, and that was all. And it was enough. The story of what happened at Cornerstone Café spread the way stories spread in cities, faster than the facts and slower than the feeling. By the end of the first week, it had acquired the mild distortions of retelling. The number of armed men varied depending on the teller. The duration of Marcus's action contracted in some versions and expanded in others, and he acquired, in the telling, various amounts of military decoration that may or may not have corresponded to reality. Marcus, who heard none of this directly and some of it indirectly through Linda's carefully deadpan briefings, said nothing about any of it. He came in at 7:45. He sat at his corner table. He ordered his coffee. He read. But things were not entirely the same, and he knew it. And he sat with that knowledge the way he sat with most things honestly, and without making more of it than it was. People looked at him differently now, which was an adjustment. Not all of the looking was comfortable. Some of it carried the slightly breathless quality of celebrity, which he found tedious in a way he had been trained to manage. Some of it carried the more useful quality of actual seeing people looking at him as though they had been looking before without quite focusing, and were now focusing and finding that what was there had been there all along. Linda noticed that he seemed, in some hard-to-define way, lighter, not happier. Necessarily happiness was a word he used rarely and with precision, but less contained, as though the event had released something that had been held under pressure for a long time. She did not ask him about this, because Linda understood that some things are better noticed than named, but she noticed it. Sophia noticed it too. She had been coming to the cafe every morning since the robbery, which was partly her regular routine, and partly something else, something she did not interrogate too carefully, because she suspected that interrogating it too carefully would either justify it or undermine it, and she was not ready for either outcome. She and Marcus had their conversations, which were longer now and ranged further, and the ease between them had acquired a depth that she associated with people she had known for years, not weeks. She told him about her work, which was urban planning, which he found genuinely interesting, in a way she had not expected. He asked good questions, questions that revealed that his understanding of how cities function went beyond the casual. She told him about her sister, who was younger and funnier, and had been her main support through the divorce. He told her about his daughter, Amara, who he described with a warmth that was almost shy, as though the love he had for her was something he was still learning how to carry in ordinary conversation without it spilling. One morning, on a Thursday in early spring, when the cafe smelled of coffee and the faint suggestion of warmer weather coming through the vents, Marcus set his book down before he had ordered his coffee and looked at Sophia with the particular directness he had the look. That was not a performance of directness, but simply was, and said, "I don't talk about myself easily. You've probably noticed." "I've noticed," she said. "I spent a long time thinking the past was something you keep separate from the present," he said. "Like it's a different country. You can visit, but you don't live there." She waited. "I'm less sure that's right," he said. "I think the past is more like the foundation. You're always standing on it. The question is whether you know it." She looked at him. "What made you less sure?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "A lot of things. Being here. Amara." Conversations with people who ask good questions. She felt something warm happen in her chest and declined to analyze it. That's a nice thing to say, she said. He looked at her in that way he had. That was not a smile, but was adjacent to one. I say things I mean, he said. I just don't always say them immediately. The morning that felt like a beginning was a Saturday, which was unusual because Marcus sometimes came in on Saturdays and sometimes did not, and Sophia had not known whether he would be there or not, and had told herself this uncertainty was irrelevant and had come in anyway. He was there. She arrived to find him already in his corner, but he had moved the second chair, the one across the table from his slightly out from its tucked position, which was a small thing, and possibly meant nothing, and possibly meant something, and she sat in it without asking. His daughter arrived 20 minutes later. Amara Johnson was 8 years old and slightly small for her age, and had her father's eyes and none of his stillness, which was to say, she was in constant cheerful motion, looking at everything, commenting on most of it, asking the server Linda, who lit up visibly upon seeing her about the names of all the pastries in the case, and whether any of them contained the amount of sugar her father said was too much, and what that amount was, exactly, in grams. She shook Sophia's hand when Marcus introduced them with a seriousness that was clearly her own genuine mode, and not a performance of grown-up behavior, and then said, Dad said you do urban planning. Does that mean you designed roads? Because I have a lot of ideas about roads. Sophia looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his coffee. He was, she realized, trying not to smile. It was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and it suited him entirely, and she thought, there it is. There is the person underneath the stillness. They stayed for almost 2 hours. Amara drew things on napkins, marine animals, mostly, with occasional forays into what she described as improvements to local traffic infrastructure, and ate a pastry that may or may not have been within the permitted sugar threshold, and conducted a thorough cross-examination of Sophia's professional history, and then announced, with the air of someone delivering a verdict that had been carefully considered, that she approved. Marcus, to his credit, managed to maintain a reasonably straight face during most of this, which Sophia suspected took as much discipline as anything else she had seen him do. When they finally rose to leave, the morning had opened into a genuinely warm spring day, the first of the season, the kind of day that feels like a promise being kept after a long period of non-communication. The street outside was full of that particular light that comes only in early spring, low and golden and slightly unreal, as if the city were briefly more beautiful than it usually allowed itself to be. Amara ran ahead to look at a dog that was being walked by a very small, elderly man, and became immediately involved in a conversation with both the dog and the man that seemed to require her full attention. Marcus and Sophia stood on the sidewalk outside Cornerstone Café, and the morning was around them, and she thought about every morning that had led to this morning, the weeks of parallel quiet, the conversations that had built themselves out of small, honest moments, the robbery and its aftermath, Ethan's apology and Marcus's response, the way he had looked that day across the room with his hands steady and his face unchanged, and the way he looked now, watching his daughter crouch down to let a dog sniff her palm, which was the same face and also completely different. She's wonderful, Sophia said. Yes, Marcus said. Simple, complete, true. They stood together for a moment in the spring light. Amara was laughing now, a genuine, full sound that came from very deep in her, and it carried back to them on the warm air. And Marcus turned slightly toward it, the way a plant turns toward light automatic. Involuntary, the most natural thing in the world. Thank you, Sophia said, without quite planning to. He looked at her. For what? She thought about it. For the way you sit in that corner, she said. I think it changed the room. I think it changed me a little. He looked at her for a long moment, with those dark, measuring eyes, and she had the sense that he was weighing something, not whether to say it, but how to say it in a way that was honest, without being more than the moment called for, and this, she understood, was how he did everything. You were already changing, he said. I just happened to be there, which was probably the truest thing either of them had said, and also not entirely true, and they both knew it. The real measure of a person Not the appearance of strength, not the badges of status, not the volume of a voice in a crowded room, is what they carry, and what they do with what they carry. When the room is quiet, and no one is watching, and nothing is asked of them, but the simple, ongoing work of being who they are. Marcus Johnson had known this for a long time, had known it in the places where knowledge lives that is paid for rather than given, and he had spent the last several years practicing it not as philosophy, but as daily discipline. The corner table, the black coffee, the book, the morning, the city outside changing and not changing. His daughter growing up in it. His past neither behind him nor ahead of him, but underneath him, where it had always been, holding him up. And that was enough. And someday it might be more than enough. But for now, on a spring morning with the light like something recovered, it was exactly what it needed to be.